All right, good afternoon. Thank you all for joining us today for our Hard Histories presentation and conversation. My name is Mallory Pilat. I am a PhD candidate in the History Department here at Johns Hopkins. I work on the history of Black American women, and more specifically, the role of France and the French language in that history. I'm also a fellow with the Hard Histories program this semester as we plan to extend our work in Paris and Berlin to European scholars. Launched in the fall of 2020, the Hard Histories at Hopkins Project examines the role that racism and discrimination have played at Johns Hopkins. Blending research, teaching, public engagement, and the creative arts, Hard Histories aims to engage our broadest communities at Johns Hopkins and in Baltimore in a frank and informed exploration of the myths that have become part of our university's story, and to offer evidence of how race and racism have shaped Johns Hopkins. In spring 2024, we are hosting a series of conversations exploring the histories of Blackness, slavery, and racism in the Maryland area and beyond. Today, we are excited to host a discussion about innovative archival methods for doing hard histories work. We invite our panelists now to turn their cameras on. We are honored to have with us today two great panelists in discussion with Hard Histories Project Director Dr. Martha Jones. Liz Beckman is the Processing and Research Archivist working as part of the Hopkins Retrospective program team. She is passionate about broadening access to archival resources and increasing the number and types of voices that are reflected in the archival record. Before coming to Hopkins, she worked as the manuscript and archive librarian at George Mason University in Fairfax, Virginia. She began working at Mason as the processing coordinator in 2014. And prior to this, she had a variety of archive-related internships in Washington, D.C. and Pittsburgh, PA. Heather Cooper is Project Archivist for the Reexamining Hopkins History Initiative at the Chesney Medical Archives, where her work focuses on processing and increasing access to collections that shed light on histories of racism, discrimination, and diversity at Johns Hopkins Medicine, nursing, and public health. She has a PhD in history and an MA in library and information science from the University of Iowa. A scholar of race, gender, and U.S. slavery, she began her archives work at the Iowa Women's Archives, where her processing, instruction, and outreach focused on engaging with diverse collections and centering the experience and records of underrepresented communities. And finally, Dr. Martha S. Jones is the Society of Black Alumni Presidential Professor, a professor of history, and a professor at the SNF Agora Institute at Johns Hopkins University. She is also a legal and cultural historian whose research explores how Black people have shaped the story of American democracy, and today extends her work on memorial landscapes and family memoir. Jones directs the Hard Histories at Hopkins Project. Her most recent book, Vanguard, How Black Women Broke Barriers, Won the Vote, and Insisted on Equality for All, published in 2020, received the 2021 Los Angeles Times Book Prize for History. Dr. Jones and our panelists will be in conversation for about 25 minutes, and then we will turn to your questions. Please submit those questions at any time using the Q&A function. Finally, live captioning is available to our audience members within Zoom, and we are also posting a link in the chat to the live transcript URL for those who prefer to access captions that way. Thank you both for being here. I will turn the conversation over to Dr. Jones, and I will see you all at the end of the discussion.
Thanks very much, Mallory. It's really great to have you with us this year at Hard Histories. Thanks for coming in and joining us for the webinar. I'm thrilled that we're starting up again this webinar series, and we've been anticipating for a good while now the opportunity to have Liz Beckman and Heather Cooper with us. So welcome to you both. At Hard Histories, particularly in the lab, we know you both very well because for a long time you've played really critical roles in the work that we do. reprocessing and making newly accessible the archival collections that you steward. And we're going to take a deep dive into some of that work. But I thought first, perhaps folks who have tuned in would like to hear a bit more about your journeys, your professional journeys to this work. Mallory gave us a thumbnail. But Heather, would you get us started and tell us a little bit about how you come to do this work? And then we'll hear from Liz too. And thanks again for being here.
Sure, absolutely. So I was trained as an academic historian. I got my PhD in US history with an emphasis in African American history at the University of Iowa. And for a couple of years after that, I was a visiting assistant professor there. I had a background in teaching in African American studies, history, and gender, women's, and sexuality studies. But obviously, I engaged with the archive as a historian and brought sources constantly into my classes as an instructor, but I hadn't necessarily thought very deeply about the archives as an institution. And in 2017, I had the opportunity to work with a local archives, the Iowa Women's Archives, to co-curate an exhibit that they were doing celebrating their 25th anniversary. It was 25 collections for 25 years. And they were guided in their selection by comments that were sent in that they solicited from students, faculty, researchers about collections that had been particularly impactful for them. And so that was some of our work to then return to those collections and think about what materials best represented that in the exhibit context. And so as a historian, I had not done very much work in the Iowa Women's Archives because there wasn't much there for me in the way of 19th century African American history. This was really my first time to go sort of behind the scenes and learn more about their collections and all of the work that they've done to build them up over time. You know, Iowa is a white majority state. Most of the collections at the archives are for white individuals and white-led organizations, but the archives had also made a particular effort to collect from underrepresented communities. And in that way, they made the archive, which often feels somehow removed from the public and the community at times, especially when it's housed at the university, they made the archive meaningful to the larger community. And this was sort of my first exposure to what it meant to be really actively collecting material and thinking critically about trying to make collections more representative, and also thinking about the many ways that the archives could potentially have meaning for people beyond the historical researcher and the intellectual labor that went into all of that work. So that was kind of a turning point for me, where I realized that there was a way to engage with the history that I loved in a different way that would allow me to interact more with the public and community members than I was sometimes able to in the classroom.
I love that because you remind me of those moments when I think for many of us, we arrive at an archive the first time, we ask a question or we have a field of interest and we learn together, right, what the holdings are, and they become visible to everybody through those real interactions. And so I really I appreciate the window into some of those more intimate behind the scenes encounters that I think a lot of us know. Liz, what about you? How do you wind up here doing this remarkable work for Hopkins Retrospective?
Yeah, for me, I was an undergraduate history major, and a lot of people come to archives through that. Colonial and imperial history was actually my area, specifically Britain and India. So U.S. history was not so much my forte. And I was convinced at one point that I was going to do a PhD program. I was going to be a South Asianist. But I realized that I didn't want to narrow my focus so intensely. I had a bit of an existential crisis, but I had a lot of fellow history majors who were going to library school for archives. And so I thought that might be something that I would be interested in. And as soon as I kind of started down that road, I was hooked. So I went to library school, got an MLIS, Master of Library and Information Science at the University of Pittsburgh. And then for 2 years, was sort of interning and permanent job searching, and landed at George Mason University in 2014 as the processing coordinator in special collections, and then kind of moved up into the manuscripts and archives librarian role in 2016. And so that move to Virginia was really interesting for me because I often think of, I don't know, the book Liar, Temptress, Soldier, Spy by Karen Abbott. In her acknowledgments for that book, she talks about being a northern transplant to the South and having this realization that for in a lot of ways the Civil War is still going on. And I had a similar experience moving to Northern Virginia. Every day when I was going to work, I was passing by Fairfax High School, whose mascot was the Rebels, and driving on the shuttle on Old Lee Highway. And that juxtaposition just really struck me. And that really does come from a place of privilege as a white woman from Northwestern Pennsylvania. I hadn't really had to confront that truth that a lot of people have to confront a lot sooner. And Mason is a Virginia State institution. And so the conversation in kind of the mid 2010s around Confederate monuments and memorialization felt very, very relevant. And so that was sort of in an archival context where I started really thinking about reparative work and about how what we're presenting really is sort of what responsibility we have as archivists. And so over the next few years, reparative work became what felt most important to me. And I started my current position with Hop Retro in May 2022. So it really gives me the space to spend time with collections and focus on reparative work, which I really, really appreciate.
One of the things I really appreciate hearing from both of you in different ways is how place matters for this work, that it isn't work that's happening removed from or abstracted from the place in which you find yourselves. It helps me understand in some ways how each of you has come then to Baltimore and been able to so effectively become part of the stories we try and tell at Hard Histories, certainly, and others as well, because I think for us too, it's one of the tenets of what we do is how much place matters, and that our questions are not only or always academic in that sense, but they're embedded in a real place with a past, but also with a present. That's very strong. Liz, let me stay with you for a minute and just ask if you could talk a little bit about sort of how you found things, the state of things when you arrive at the university archives. Maybe another way of thinking about that is, how was it that the work, this reparative work, as you put it, how is that work, I guess, needed at the university archives?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, when I came in, there were a lot of collections in the university archives that were described in the 1980s and the early 1990s. That was sort of when a lot of the current finding aids, particularly for things like faculty papers, were written at that time. And archival professional standards have definitely evolved since then, just in a lot of ways, in terms of what we emphasize in description, what sorts of fields we're consistently using. And another thing too is that finding aids from that era were produced in a different environment. They were produced in a typewritten environment or a kind of an early word processor. So, and currently Archive Space is the database that we use. So it's a database format, which is very different from that static kind of Word document. So that has led to some interesting kind of import issues and nesting issues when you're looking at a finding aid. So that makes things challenging for users and for archivists too. It's tricky for everybody. But what I will say is that there was a lot of energy and interest in kind of remediating collections and incorporating reparative practice. There was a new university archivist, Katie Carey, started in 2021. So that was a big change. And then some of my colleagues, Allison Seiler, who is the Hop Retro program manager, as well as Kristen Deal, who is the processing archivist, and her predecessor, Annie Tang, were bringing a lot of ideas about reparative practice already. Things like working with protesters to collect posters from the Garland Hall sit-ins against the JHPD. So there was already, I was not the kind of instigator of this work in the archives. I want to make sure that that I do not deserve that credit. But the issue is often in a lot of places that there's not enough staff, there's not enough time. There's always a constant flow of material coming in. There's a backlog. Archivists are always, processing archivists in particular, we're always talking about the backlog. And so there's just really always a need to invest in processing and more processors to do reparative work. And that's how quality archival description gets done. And so my particular job is looking at university related collections, currently focusing on early university history. And this work just really is necessary because it provides a fuller picture. Because these narratives are, as one of my undergrad English professors would always say, that things are there to be seen in the text. And I think these fuller narratives are there to be seen in collections. We just need to call them out.
I appreciate you reminding us there's a whole technical revolution that's connected to this work. I'm still the kind of researcher who shows up in an archive and expects somebody to hand me a binder with a finding aid, only to be met with, have a look online. And so I think a lot of us have lived through a lot of the technical changes that are exciting, but I think I'm still nostalgic for the old fashioned on the shelf finding aid, truth be told. Heather, let me ask you a similar question if I could. For you, when you arrived at Chesney Medical Archives, I mean, are you opening a new chapter there when you arrive? And for you in particular, I wanted to know, how did you know, or how did you determine where you would begin this work? And by the way, we love your background. It's just exactly right for this discussion. So
yes,
thank you for that.
Mess. That is behind everything. I was opening a new chapter in the sense that I was hired for a special project. And this is something that, archives are perpetually underfunded and understaffed. So this was something that the existing staff did not have the time or resources to pursue. Reexamining Hopkins History was a new initiative specifically directed at trying to identify and increase accessibility to records of racism and discrimination in the history of the university, as well as Johns Hopkins Medicine, Nursing, and Public Health. But that's not to say that there was not interest on the part of individual staff members in helping researchers pursue these kinds of topics. It was just something that was sort of being handled on an individual basis rather than being able to kind of engage in a full-fledged project that would address these on a broader level. So before I arrived, in anticipation of that, the staff, and in particular, my colleague Phoebe Evans-Latosha, had put together a list of collections that they knew or suspected needed to be re-examined in some way, and that would have content relevant to thinking about racism and diversity. And so that was kind of a starting place. There were over 80 collections on this. I'm here on a term position for 3 years, so we had to set some additional priorities for what could be accomplished in that amount of time. And essentially, we tried to focus on 3 things: collections that would shed light on early institutional history. And this came partly out of, Reexamining Hopkins history was partly born out of the discovery of the census records related to Johns Hopkins as an enslaver. And so trying to connect the history of the medical institutions to some of the thinking and re-examining that was going on related to the university itself. So we wanted to think about key figures in these institutions' early history who might be appropriate for re-examination and might have aspects of their backgrounds and their professional work that hadn't been fully described or explored. We also wanted to think about departments and institutions and programs that particularly impacted people of color as patients, as research subjects, faculty, staff, community members. And in addition to that, we wanted to find collections and spend the time to process collections that would give us insight into the experiences and contributions of members of the faculty who were people of color. And other professionals and staff. So, for example, there were several collections of African-American practitioners which had come in the last, say, 5 years, but had not yet been processed, and so weren't available to the public. So those went on the list as some of our first priorities. But ultimately, the Colored Orphan Asylum, which I know we'll talk about more, was the first thing that I started with, and it made a lot of sense because it was an early institution. It was one of the institutions that Johns Hopkins himself directed the founding of and saw as sort of as a central part of his legacy and bequest. And it was something that had been kind of forgotten and unexplored in the history of Johns Hopkins, which when I arrived here, I was very struck, thinking about place. When I arrived here, I was very struck by how important the narrative of the history of the medical institutions is to the entire institution here. It's just such a key part of the story that they tell about themselves. And so, beginning to sort of look at that a little bit more critically was part of what we needed to do.
You're so right, I think, about how, perhaps rightly so, the history of the hospital and the medical school figure so importantly in perceptions and images and understandings of the institution. I'm in Germany this year and in Berlin at the Wissenschaftskolleg, and when people ask me about Johns Hopkins, that is inevitably what they're asking me about. And I have to do the work of explaining. We do other things as well, including history. But I think you're so right that coming back to that story and getting that story right, filling that story out is so important. Let me ask you about the colored orphan, the so-called colored orphan asylum, because that's what brought us together. Our followers have followed, in a sense, the fruits of your rethinking of that collection as they watched us in the lab go back to recover the story of the asylum, and in particular, the lives of the girls who were resident there. But before you reached out to us, before you encouraged us to come up to the Chesney and to spend time there with the material to see what we could learn, you'd already done a lot of rethinking about the collection. Can you help us sort of behind the scenes understand sort of what happens when you get there and how you approach this rethinking? Because I don't think it's evident. There's a way in which, you know, a finding aid, even a dated one, can seem like it's already done the job. And so how do you approach the rethinking?
Well, there wasn't a lot that had been done or thought about the Colored Orphan Asylum before I came. You know, it was one of the first collections that came to the archives when it opened in 1978-79. It's a small collection. It was for an institution that had been closed since 1924. And the records at first glance don't seem terribly exciting or fruitful. So it was put in the catalog so that researchers could see that it was there, and then it was set aside. There was a one-sentence description of the collection when I arrived. So, you know, it was really starting from scratch. And, you know, I think it's an example of how important the ability to really spend time on research when you're processing something is, and where my sort of background in both history and archives was an important element in this. So I spent a lot more time researching, not only in the collection, but also in related materials, a lot more time than one normally would when you process. And I was basically trying to reconstruct a narrative history of the asylum for the biographical and administrative history note. One that would be full enough that it would provide a context which I felt researchers really needed to get the most out of the materials. And it was a narrative of its history that was not easy to put together, right? So it wouldn't be easy for a researcher to go for the first time to the collection and be able to pull out the details necessary to understand how it existed over time, what changes were made, how it was organized and managed, et cetera. So that was a really big part of it. And as I was working on that, you know, it also became clear how important the institution was from Mr. Johns Hopkins' perspective, and how important it seemed to be to the Johns Hopkins Hospital Board of Trustees in the early days, right? So they actually, when they were building the hospital, there were efforts to go visit other hospitals in the US and in Europe to see them as models. They actually did the same thing regarding the orphan asylum. And they had plans drawn up for a major facility. So, you know, the question is, how did we get from that initial idea and hope and potential investment in the institution to one that is closed and never given significant resources to run and do its business, and, you know, has essentially been written out of the narrative of the medical institutions. So that was a question. I was also thinking about wanting to help researchers essentially see what value could be wrung from the sources that were there, which again, at first glance might seem not particularly helpful. So there was so little information about the young women themselves who were kept as wards, and that was frustrating. In the finding aid, I acknowledged that silence. Rather than just simply saying, well, it's not there, so we don't need to talk about it, I draw attention to the fact that that isn't there. And I point out the bits and pieces of information that can be gleaned from the different kinds of sources that are there. And because I looked so closely at the materials, I'm able to really go into detail about what the financial records can tell us. And, a big part of the collection are these receipts that were kept, because interestingly, I think it's interesting that that's one of the main things we have telling the story of this institution, the financial records that they kept about their expenses. And normally, I might not think that was going to be a very useful source, but in fact, looking at the receipts was one of the ways that I first began to be able to piece together some of the biographical details of the young women. And then your class followed suit and was able to do the same. So, it was an effort to kind of make clearer for the potential researcher what could be pulled out of this, and also encourage them to think about the racial overtones at play in the way that the asylum was run and managed, and the choices that were made regarding the young women.
I have vivid memories of our being in the reading room at the Chesney, first having read Now Your Finding Aid, right, and your introduction to the asylum, which really was our orientation as a group to the institution. Nothing of nothing has been nothing had been written, right, that was comprehensive or was an overview of the Colored Orphan Asylum. Our producers reminding me just to say that Johns Hopkins Colored Orphan Asylum is the third prong of Mr. Hopkins's vision for the institution. There is a hospital, there is the university, and there is also this asylum, which opens in 1875, am I remembering that right, Heather, and runs more or less until 1920, first located not far from the original university, and then moves up at the end of the 19th century to close to what is today, or really on what is today, the Homewood campus. And our work was to use those curious and shard-like accounting materials, right? The archives of the financial side of the asylum to try and then recover the lives of the girls there. And I remember you with us in the reading room as we were, I think, a little slack-jawed at, how slim the materials were. So we've thanked you many times, but we can't thank you too many times for that. Liz, I'm going to turn to you, but I just want to remind folks your questions. I see questions are beginning to fill in, but you're welcome, please, to use the Q&A function and drop questions there, and there'll be time for those before we close up today. Liz, when we began working at Hard Histories back in 2020, one of the first stories that came to us was about the classics department and Professor Basil Gildersleeve. As I heard the story, the classics department was beginning to learn more about Professor Gildersleeve and his legacy, his ideas, and was contemplating renaming their seminar room, which had long ago been named for him. So you arrive at Hopkins Retrospective, and this becomes one of your early projects. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about that and how the collection and its presentation for researchers changes after you've spent time with it.
Absolutely. Yeah. Professor Gildersleeve was kind of on the Hop Retro radar. And so that's he came up very early as someone who needed reconsideration. And there had been some slight adjustment of the bio note to include some of what the classics department had was sort of the way that they were grappling. And so so my colleague Kristen Deal had done some small updates, but I was really able to dig in and spend some time. I think Heather put it really well. Just sort of we're able, part of kind of the what's really special about what we're able to do is that we are able to spend more time than a lot of processors are able to spend with these collections. And I think it's really important that our positions have been created that way. But so I did kind of a deep dive into the collection to just get a sense of sort of what was going on there, and with the idea of writing a new bio note for the finding aid, along with just general cleanup work, and trying to make the series arrangement less confusing and that sort of thing. So I spent a lot of time, and this is something that I have kind of gotten in the habit of doing, spending a lot of time in the correspondence of collections. But in that process, I found myself wondering what Gildersleeve's Wikipedia page said about him. I'm not even sure what sparked that in my mind while I was going through the correspondence, but when I went to that page, somebody had edited it at some point to acknowledge that a Black woman from Charlottesville, Virginia, Fanny Tonsler, had that Basil Gildersleeve, who was a white ex-Confederate soldier who had written horrific things during the Civil War, editorials in a Richmond newspaper, deeply white supremacist and racist, that he was listed on her death certificate as her father. And so I had not heard this. This was not on my radar at all. And so I spoke with Jim Stimpert, who was the longtime reference archivist, senior reference archivist for special collections and the University Archives, and he also was unaware of this, and so that led me on a course of research to try to find out as much about Fanny and her life as I could, and it just you know, the documentation is there. It's one of those things that, like I said earlier, that there to be seen thing. Fanny was always there. I didn't discover anything. Her gravestone in Charlottesville, Virginia, says Fanny Gildersleeve Tonsler, and I actually had the opportunity to see that grave. Monica Blair and I, at the university's Studying Slavery conference, were able to go, and there's an organization called the Preservers of the Daughters of Zion Cemetery, and two of the leaders of that organization, Edwina St. Rose and Bernadette Whitsitt Hammond, who are doing amazing work, were generous enough to give us a tour of the cemetery and tell us a little more. So they're just some of the people. There are many people, academics and community members, who were aware of this story. So I have since then incorporated that into the biographical note of the finding aid, the story of Fanny Tonsler and her husband, Benjamin Tonsler, who was a prominent Black educator in Charlottesville in the years following the Civil War, and did so much for the community there, and for education. So that really, it's always been there. It is a more complete version of the narrative now, and researchers now have that additional context.
the phrase, or hiding in plain sight
Mhm.
comes to mind. But it is remarkable as I'm listening to both of you, the ways in which, on the one hand, you are, in a sense, right, the first historians in these collections, right, beginning to craft new narratives, guiding us, right, inviting us to ask new kinds of questions. And at the same time, I think leaving lots of room for those of us who come behind you to continue to do the work. It's really, I think, part of what I wanted to be sure we came away from today's conversation with, was that sense of the partnership between those of us who advertise ourselves as historians, and those of you who are historians, and oftentimes the frontline historians, thinking about our questions even before we know to ask them. And so these are such important stories. I probably have time for a question, and there are lots of questions here I want to get to, but I want to definitely turn to the work I know you both have done around the reparative description working group at Johns Hopkins. Here, representatives from across the Hopkins libraries have come together around redescribing, recontextualizing records to an important degree around language that is, and this is a quote, inaccurate, outdated, even offensive and harmful. Folks who follow our Substack read a bit last week about really what is a movement across libraries and archives in this respect. Liz, would you start us off here, maybe with an introduction to this particular work, and then I'll ask Heather to come in and add her perspective.
Absolutely, yeah, and I do want to acknowledge the people who've kind of paved the way for us to do this work, who we've drawn on. Archives for Black Lives in Philadelphia, Dorothy Berry, Kelly Boulding, Jessica Ty, Lael Hughes-Watkins at UMD. They've just been some of my inspirations, so many other names, but we in the working group, sort of the way that we approach a lot of these questions, we're drawing on a real community within kind of the archival community. So the reparative description working group is composed of archivists from the Hamburger University Archives on the Homewood campus, the Peabody Archives, Chesney Medical Archives, and then folks from Homewood Museum as well. So we get together regularly, and we're working as a collective to kind of figure out what the implementation of reparative description looks like at our various repositories. So for us at the Hamburger University Archives, we are currently in the process of a reparative audit that is based on a similar project that has been done at Princeton University. We've borrowed their lexicon of terms and have adjusted it, have used it as a guide to create our own list of terms that either ought to be examined or might point to language that could be re-examined. And so Kristen Deal, Rachel Gadenmeyer, Katie Carey, and myself are currently working on that audit using a tool created by archivists at Duke. Actually, we're able to search those terms within our finding aids, and that tool then does an output of a spreadsheet of hits, essentially. And then we go through those results, and we sometimes make immediate changes, and other times we make notes about bigger changes that are needed. And so far we have worked through more than 200 collections. So we've progressed quite a bit through that.
Great. Heather, I want you to come in and add to what Liz has already shared about the working group. But maybe I could ask you, and this is my last question before I turn to the audience. Just if you might also just tell us, it's a broad question, but I think why this work matters from your perspective, and perhaps more broadly, what you'd like to see come out of it over time.
I think this work is incredibly important, and I think that we have an obligation to potential users who we need to think about more broadly. Archives are often places that are associated with academic historians, people at the university itself, the people who may be in leadership positions and have donated their records there, as though that is the primary constituency that we're obligated to. What I wish and would love to see at the Chesney, as well as other institutions, is for the archive to become a more welcoming place for members of the community and others who are not necessarily drawn there for academic interests, but come from a variety of backgrounds and know that they have access to those materials. So the statement regarding harmful language and the work that we do to try to repair and provide additional context is partly about having respect and empathy and compassion for potential users who may be confronted with that language and find it triggering or offensive or hateful. Certainly there's content in our collections that is potentially going to have that effect, but we can do something about the archivist created description that is presenting this material to the public. And I think, things like the statement on harmful content are a chance to be transparent, to acknowledge that harm has been done, that there is harmful material there, that we are actively working to address it, and that we welcome people's comments and feedback, and we want them to let us know if they encounter something. I think that really changes the relationship between the archive and the potential user and their understanding of the archive as a welcoming space. So I think it's kind of a first step in making the archive, whatever it may be, more meaningful and more accessible to the larger community.
Thanks for that so much, and you're speaking directly to one of the questions that we had from a viewer, which was about a white-led institution like Johns Hopkins as a gatekeeper. And the question asks, in part, are there other traditions like the Black radical tradition that we should be thinking about as we're processing and rethinking collections on the one hand, and other partners in that work, community-based partners in particular, that should be part of the process? And I'll let whoever wants to come in on that.
Yeah, I definitely want to mention the work of Inheritance Baltimore in sort of that vein. Our colleague Tanika Berkeley is one of the co-leaders of the Community Archives project of Inheritance Baltimore, and so she and Angela Kukui at UB at University of Baltimore are doing a lot of that work, and so I want to make sure that they get mentioned as people who are doing that.
Thanks for, and thanks, I think Young Song has put up a link to Inheritance Baltimore here. But I think there's another story to tell that we won't get to quite today, which is about the making and the remaking of the archive itself through community partnerships, through undertakings like Inheritance Baltimore, which don't begin institutionally as an archive or a library, but I think have become really critical to the development of another kind of university-like library today. So thanks for that, Liz. And I see there are a number of questions about our work collectively on the Johns Hopkins Orphan Asylum, and we won't get to those today, unfortunately, but I want to let people know that you can either follow our Substack or visit our YouTube page, and you'll find a great deal of explication and exploration of the work that we have done to date on the orphan asylum. So I thank everybody for their interest in that really important work, and I hope you'll follow the Substack and our YouTube page, where we've done webinars that feature the important work that's been done in the lab and elsewhere on that topic.
Just a quick reminder that the
Yep.
finding aid is online, and you can find it at the Chesney Medical Archives website.
Yeah, thank you for that. Thank you for that too, Heather. You actually have a really great introductory page that not only takes us to the finding aid, but to other related resources, other parts of the collection where we might not expect to find the asylum, but in fact it was there. And so I know we really benefited from that. So another question is sort of a bird's eye one, but I think it's worth asking, which is about the ways in which there are national organizations like the Society for American Archivists or the Association of College and Research Libraries that are, I don't know, supporting, encouraging, maybe standardizing this work. And are these also touchstones for you? I mean, one of the things I was really struck by in preparing for this is the extraordinary list of institutions that are also kind of taking on this work. I don't know, Heather, do you mind coming in on that and just helping us see the way in which this is a story, yes, at Johns Hopkins, but really a much bigger one?
Sure. Liz mentioned that, you know, the Archivist for Black Lives in Philadelphia as one of our sort of models. They developed an anti-racist description resource, and there are many others that provide guidelines regarding reparative description. But that for me is kind of a touchstone, because it not only thinks about the significance of this work for previously processed collections, right, language we need to go back to, but how we can continue to be very conscientious about the language we use moving forward to describe new collections. And I believe it was last year, the Society of American Archivists adopted their anti-racist description resource as an external standard for this work. So there's a lot of support in the profession. And I will say, you know, really, this has been going on to different degrees for over a decade at different institutions. But after the murder of George Floyd, we also saw a real change in archives' commitment to trying to address what they knew existed as harm in their own repositories. And I saw a lot of changes for individual archives wanting to include a harmful language statement, et cetera, and address those kinds of things in the wake of that and the reinvigoration of Black Lives Matter.
Liz, did you want to come in on this?
Yeah, I would definitely say, I think, you know, it really has been at the kind of grassroots level that a lot of this has kind of trickled. don't know if that's trickled up or how you might phrase that, but I think it's been a ground up initiative at a lot of places. I think, archivists, particularly archivists of color, have been asking these questions and working toward repair a long time before it became mainstream in organizations like SAA. But I think it is also really important that those organizations have finally recognized. And I think, as Heather said, it was the murder of George Floyd when that really came to a head at the national level.
I think it's a strong note for us to end on, that reminder, right, of our work. I think that sometimes can be characterized as removed or happening in an ivory tower, is so directly connected to what's happening on our streets, in our communities, and to ourselves. So it's my job to thank you both, and I'm going to turn things over in a moment back to Mallory Pilat to close us out. But I want to end today with a special thanks to our colleagues behind the scenes, our producer, Lauren Feldman, who is here chatting, making sure I stay on point, and Young Song from the SNF Agora Institute, who makes sure that all the technical pieces fall into place. This is the first season in which we are resuming our webinars without our dear colleague and friend, Catherine Pierre. We lost Catherine last year, and we wanted to just pay a small tribute to her here, because she really was the courage, the inspiration, the brains, and the technical wizard behind our webinar series when we began. And so we miss Catherine very much, and we want to dedicate this season to her, and feel very much her spirit with us as we continue work that I know was so very important to her. So thank you, Catherine, so much. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Mallory, who I think is here somewhere. Hi, Mallory.
Hi, thanks, Martha. Thank you very much to Liz Beckman, Heather Cooper, and Martha Jones, of course, for this incredibly rich conversation. We're honored to have had you here, and we appreciate how your research sheds light on the questions we are asking at the Hard Histories at Hopkins Project. This conversation reminded me that, not only do the archives tell us a story with their content, but they also tell a very important story with the way that they're curated and labeled and organized. And I think this is also an important reminder and acknowledgement of the people who have come before us to do this labor, who, as our panelists have pointed out, have often been people of color, like Dorothy Porter, who curated and built the Moreland Spingarn Center at Howard University. And I also want to shout out the work of Stuart Schrader and Victoria Harms, along with Heather Furness and Tonika Berkeley, and a group of students who have worked together recently on expanding the reach of the Black Panther newspaper archive that Hopkins has acquired recently to local schools in Baltimore. So look into that if you have time. Thank you so much to our audience as well for watching and for sending in your great questions, and to the team, of course, at SNF Agora Institute for their support for this event. You can learn more about Hard Histories at Hopkins at hardhistory.jhu.edu. Additional information about our event series, as well as YouTube videos of our past events, is posted at snfagora.jhu.edu/event. Our next webinar is going to be on March 13th, featuring Rachel L. Swarns and David Carey Jr. Swarns and Carey will be discussing the centrality of slavery to the rise of Catholic universities in the DMV area. So mark your calendars. And to register to that, please click on the link in the chat or use the QR code on your screen. Please also consider subscribing to our Substack at hardhistoriesghu.substack.com, where we regularly post updates about what we're up to. Thank you all so much and have a great rest of your day.